Stop. Stop right there. Who do you think you are, tracking your filth across my floor? You're garbage, old man. Plain and simple, a piece of dirt that wandered in off the road. And somebody at this club has finally got the spine to say it to your face, because clearly not one soul in your entire life ever cared enough to. Now don't move another inch. You see that floor? Italian marble, polished every single morning before the first member tees off, and you've just dragged whatever's caked on those boots straight across it like it's a barn. Look at you. Coveralls stained green at the knees from kneeling in other people's dirt, a shirt soaked through with sweat, gloves hanging out of your back pocket with the fingers worn clean through. And those hands, God, look at them. Black under every nail, cracked, split at the knuckle, the hands of a man who spent his whole life on his knees in the soil, pulling weeds for people who matter. Honey, hands like that have never once held a membership card, and they never will.
And the man he was saying all of this to, Corey Ellison, 72 years old, standing in the marble lobby of the Hawthorne Grove clubhouse in soil-stained coveralls, a battered seed envelope clutched in one cracked, earth-blackened hand looked at the young clubhouse manager in his pressed white polo for a long, quiet moment. He didn't turn around. He didn't move toward the door. He glanced once across the great oak-paneled lobby, out through the tall windows at the rolling green of the 18th hole in the afternoon light. And then he looked back at the young man and said, very gently, "I came to see how the old oak is doing." He had no idea, and the young man standing over him had even less of an idea that the next 40 minutes were about to take that hushed, gleaming, 4 generations deep clubhouse and turn it completely inside out. And that before the member event ever began that afternoon, every staffer and every caddy and every blue-blooded member in that building would know the name Corey Ellison, and would never, as long as they lived, forget the way they came to learn it. This is the story of Corey in the afternoon that changed Hawthorne Grove forever. 3 days earlier, in a wood-paneled boardroom, in a quiet brick building at the edge of a city an hour away, a small group of trustees and lawyers sat around a long table, and the chair of the foundation that owned more than they could easily count took off his reading glasses, set them on a document, and said 4 sentences so plain and so final that the room simply stopped arguing. The man was Cornelius Ellison, and the foundation he chaired was the Ellison Land Trust, though his name was carved nowhere on its door, and printed nowhere on its letterhead in any size that would catch an eye. Because Corey had spent his whole long life learning that a man who needs his name written large is usually a man trying to drown out a doubt about whether he deserves it at all. And he had no such need. 70 years before that afternoon, Cornelius Ellison had been born in a tenant cottage at the very edge of the land that would, decades later, become the Hawthorne Grove Golf Course. His father had been a groundskeeper, not a member. Never a member. A black man who tended the grass and trimmed the hedges and was expected to be invisible while he did it, and his mother had cleaned the very clubhouse Corey was now standing in. Corey had grown up in the dirt at the margins of that club. A boy who was allowed to caddy if he kept his eyes down. Allowed to rake the bunkers, but never to swing a club. Allowed to exist on that beautiful green land only so long as he was working it for someone else. He had loved the land anyway, had loved it the way only a boy shut out of something can love it, and when he grew up, he had left, and gone into the only thing he understood better than anyone, which was land itself, how to buy it, how to tend it, how to make it worth something and keep it from the people who would ruin it. Over 50 years, he had built a land trust and a fortune in real estate so quietly and so vast that almost no one knew the size of it. And 8 months before that afternoon, when the old families who ran Hawthorne Grove had run the club to the edge of bankruptcy and the land beneath it had gone up for quiet sale, it was Corey Ellison, the groundskeeper's son, The boy who'd raked their bunkers with his eyes down, who had bought it. All of it. The course. The clubhouse. The 11-year waiting list. The 4 generations of belonging. The land his father had tended and his mother had cleaned now belonged, every blade of it, to their son. The young man currently calling him a piece of garbage drew a paycheck that traced through a management company and 3 layers above it, straight back to Corey Ellison's signature. And Corey had never once stopped loving the work of the land. He still got down on his knees in soil. He kept a garden at his own home that he tended himself every morning, because he said, a man who forgets the feel of dirt in his hands has forgotten where everything he owns actually comes from. His hands were black under the nails and cracked at the knuckles, the same hands his father had had, and he was proud of every split and callus. He wore the same soil-stained coveralls his whole adult life, the kind his father had worn, because they were honest and they were comfortable, and a richer man's clothes had never once grown a better tomato. He drove an old pickup with bags of mulch in the bed. He owned one good suit for the boardroom, and the rest of the time he dressed as exactly what he had been born as and never stopped being underneath everything, a man of the soil. The thing he carried, the object that matters in this story, and goes on mattering all the way. To its final line was a small paper seed envelope, soft and creased from years of folding, the printing on it long faded, holding a few dark seeds rattling in one corner. It had belonged to his father, Moses, who in 50 years of tending the grounds of a club that would never have him as a member, had been allowed exactly one small dignity, a corner of land behind the maintenance sheds, out of sight, where he was permitted to grow a few vegetables for his own family. And there, at the back of that hidden garden, Moses had planted, against all the rules, a single oak sapling grown from an acorn, started in that very seed envelope, and had told his young son the words Corey carried every day of his life since. Listen to me, boy. They'll let me grow this tree back here where they can't see it. Because a tree doesn't ask anybody's permission to belong. It just puts its roots down in the ground and it grows. And one day it'll be bigger and older and worth more than any man who ever told me to use the back door. The land doesn't care what's written on a card. Son, the land knows the difference between a man who tends it and a man who only struts across it. You be the one who tends it. And don't you ever let them make you believe you don't belong on ground your own hands have touched. Moses had died when Corey was 19, and the oak he'd planted in secret had grown, in the half-century since, into the single most magnificent tree on the entire property, a vast spreading oak beside the 18th green that the members now photographed for their Christmas cards, that the club had named, in a brochure, a Hawthorne Grove landmark. Never once knowing it had been planted in defiance by a groundskeeper, they'd refused to let in the front door. The reason Cornelius Ellison had driven out to Hawthorne Grove that particular afternoon, in his coveralls, in his old pickup, with his father's seed envelope in his pocket, was the most personal reason a man can have. He had heard from the grounds crew that the great oak, his father's oak, was sick. Some kind of rot at the roots. The arborist had said it might have to come down. And Corey, who had bought the entire club partly so that no one could ever take that tree from him, had come to see it himself, with his own eyes and his own hands. Before anyone decided its fate, he had told no one at the club who he was. He wanted no manager hovering, no parade. He wanted to walk out to his father's tree the way his father had walked the grounds, unseen, in his work clothes, and put his cracked hands on the bark and find out the truth. He had come in through the front doors, for the first time in his life, on purpose, because he was done. At 72, using the back, He had not expected to be sent to the dumpsters before he ever reached the green. The young clubhouse manager's name was Trip Caldwell. And he had a problem. And the problem was that he was a member's son who had failed at everything. A member's son is supposed to succeed at... And everyone at the club knew it. Trip was 29. His family had belonged to Hawthorne Grove for 3 generations. He had grown up on its lawns. And he had been quietly understood. His whole life. To be a disappointment washed out of 2 colleges. Failed. At 2 ventures his father's friends had funded as favors. And finally installed as clubhouse manager in a job that was, everyone understood without saying it, charity dressed up as employment. And Trip, drowning in the shame of being the lesser version of the people he'd grown up among, had decided that the way to finally matter, the way to prove he belonged at the top of the world he'd been born into and was failing to hold on to, was to become the fiercest guardian of its gates, to be the one who kept the riffraff out, who protected the members' sense of exclusivity, who made the club feel as pure and as untouchable as the members wanted it to feel. If he could not be impressive, he could at least be useful as a wall. He called it, in his own mind, protecting the membership. He had a small habit, when he was about to be cruel, of tugging the cuffs of his polo straight, first one sleeve and then the other. A small, fastidious gesture, as if squaring himself up before the unpleasant work of putting someone in their place. So, when an old man in soil-stained coveralls walked through the front doors of the Hawthorne Grove clubhouse at 1:15 on a bright afternoon, an old seed envelope in one earth-blackened hand and a pair of cracked working hands at his sides, Trip Caldwell tugged his cuffs straight, and the afternoon began. At uno, cincis presece. He did not even speak to Corey first. He performed. Instead, for the lobby, a member in golf whites was crossing toward the grill room, and Trip caught the eye of his assistant at the front desk and said, pitched just loud enough to carry, with a thin, pained smile. One moment, the grounds crew knows they're not to come through the front. But every so often, one of them forgets his place. The assistant gave an uncomfortable little laugh. The member in whites glanced at the old man in coveralls. Then away. Pointedly. The way you'd ignore a spill someone else was paid to clean. There. Right there. Are your silent witnesses, the ones who would remember every word of this for the rest of their lives, and who in that moment said absolutely nothing at all. And the old man simply stood and absorbed it. The first stone, without a flinch, his thumb moving once across the soft, worn paper of the envelope in his hand. At uno, ops presece. Trip turned the full beam of his attention onto Corey and began the work in earnest. In a smooth, regretful, almost gentle, register the falsely kind voice that the practiced cruel ones use. The one that performs reluctance. That insists the whole ugly business pains the speaker far more than the target. Which cuts so much deeper than shouting ever could because it dresses contempt in the costume of courtesy and dares you to be ungrateful for it. Sir, he said, I can see you're not trying to make trouble. I can. So, I'm going to be honest with you. Because honesty's the only kindness that's any use to a man in your position. You've come in the wrong door. Maybe nobody ever explained it to you. Maybe wherever you've worked before, they were lax about it. But there's a way these things are done here. And the way they're done is that the men who work the grounds do not come through the members' entrance. Ever. It isn't personal. It's simply how a place like this stays what it is. Everything about you, the coveralls, the boots, the dirt, it all says the same thing. And the thing it says is times around the back. Corey, in the middle of that marble lobby, said again, evenly. I came to look at the big oak by the 18th. The old one. I heard she's sick. At unu, doazech shiunu. The idea of this filthy old groundskeeper having opinions about the club's prize tree seemed to genuinely amuse Trip. And amusement, in a man like that, is more dangerous than anger. The oak, he repeated, and let a soft breath out through his nose. Half a laugh. All pity. You came to look at the oak. Sir, that tree is a Hawthorne Grove landmark. It's in our brochure. Members have their wedding photos taken under it. The arborists who look after it charge more per hour than you make in a week. And they have degrees. With the greatest respect in the world, whatever you think you know about that tree, from raking leaves under it, somewhere in your life, it is not your concern. And it is certainly not a reason to come tracking mud through my lobby. So whatever brought you to those front doors, some idea that you'd be welcome. Some confusion about which entrance is yours. Let me set you straight. The members' world and your world do not meet at the front door. They meet at the service entrance, around the back, where they have always met. And that is genuinely where you need to go. At unu, doazech shipatru. Here is where the cruelty stopped being only words. Trip's eye fell on the soft, creased envelope in Corey's hand, and he reached out and, with two fastidious fingers, plucked it half out of the old man's grip, turning it, peering at the faded printing. The few dark seeds shifting inside. And what is this? He said, with a small pained wince of distaste. Are these times seeds? You walked into the most exclusive clubhouse in the state, carrying a beat-up paper packet of seeds in your dirty hand, like a child bringing a rock to school. Sir, this is exactly what I mean. This is the whole thing. Right here. In your hand, the members of this club command boardrooms. They run banks. And you've come through their front door clutching a faded little seed envelope so old you can't even read what it ever said. Let me give you the whole truth at once. All of it. Since the world's plainly spent 70 years tiptoeing around it to spare your feelings. And look where that's gotten you, standing on marble being told to use the dumpster door. There is no place for you in this room. There never was. And there never will be. There is nothing in that grubby little packet, and nothing in whatever life put those cracks in your hand that buys you one step through these front doors. So put your seeds away, and pick up your sorry self, and go around to the back where the help belongs. Because every second you stand here clutching that thing, this only gets more pathetic. For you, most of all. And there it is, the small human breaking point that every real person has, and that the cruel always seem to find without ever knowing what they're aiming at. The door, the tree, the lobby. Corey had absorbed all of it, standing perfectly still, his weathered face composed. A man who had been told to use the back door so many times in his life that he had built a fortress against the words decades ago. But when Trip plucked his father's seed envelope from his hand on two fingers and called it a grubby little packet, something moved in the old man at last. His cracked right hand came up, slow, and closed gently over the envelope, drawing it back out of the young man's fingers and into the shelter of his palm. And his thumb pressed down on the soft, worn paper. Once. Hard. The way it had 10,000 times across 50 years. His jaw tightened. His eyes, which had been calm and dark and patient, went suddenly bright and hard and wet all at once. For one single second, this man, who had loved a piece of land his whole life, looked as though he might, at last, raise his voice. And then he breathed in slow floor polish and cut grass, drifting in through the open doors and the faint green smell of the course beyond. The smell of his whole life. The smell of his father. And he put it back down inside himself, brick by deliberate brick, and chose, on purpose, and at visible cost, not to, that 1 second is the whole of him. Hold on to it. There's a young woman in this story, and her name is Tasha. She was 22 years old, 6 weeks into her first job in the pro shop, and at 1:25, she was standing near the lobby doorway with an armful of scorecards, watching the whole thing with a color rising in her face that she could not control. When Tripp plucked the old man's envelope from his hand and called it grubby, Tasha set the scorecards down on the counter with a small, hard slap and stepped forward. "Mr. Caldwell, sir, I can help him. I can radio the grounds crew and find out what he's here about. Or I can just walk him out to the 18th myself. It's no trouble at all. Let me just—" Tasha. Tripp did not so much as turn his head toward her. "The carts on the lower lot need cleaning. Go and clean them. Now. And then." To Corey, tugging his cuffs straight and recovering his regretful little smile. "You'll have to forgive her. She's new. She still thinks anyone who walks in deserves a hand. She'll learn how this place works. You, sir, are her lesson for the afternoon. So do try to take it with a little grace. Grace is free. And it may be the only thing in this entire clubhouse that you can actually afford." Tasha went toward the lower lot, the scorecards abandoned, her spine rigid and her eyes shining and furious. Remember, Tasha, everything in this story comes back around to Tasha. At Unu, Doazech she opt. A foursome of members swept in through the front doors in a wave of golf whites and easy laughter. Fresh off the front nine, and Tripp transformed in front of Corey like a man stepping out of shadow into sunlight. The regret vanished. The smile bloomed wide and warm and entirely genuine. "Mr. Whitfield, gentlemen, welcome back in. How'd the front nine treat you? The grill's got your table ready and I had them chill the good bottles." He ushered them past the old man as though Corey were a coat stand. A fixture, a thing in the room rather than a person in it. And as they passed, one of them, Whitfield, let his gaze slide over the man in the soil-stained coveralls with the smooth, practiced, frictionless dismissal of someone raised from birth to look straight through the help. And he said something low to the others. And they chuckled. And they were gone toward the grill. And Corey stood there, having been, for one perfectly engineered moment, turned into furniture in a clubhouse that his own father had cleaned and that he himself now owned. That, more than any single insult, was the true shape of Tripp's whole craft. Not cruelty, exactly, but the smooth and total erasure of certain people out of the category of times people, times altogether. At Unu, Trizech she Unu. With the Whitfield foursome settled in the grill, Tripp came back and found the old man still standing there, and his patience finally thinned into something harder and colder. "You're still here," he said, and the performed warmth was scraped clean off now, down to the bare metal underneath. "I've been patient with you. I've been more than patient. I've been gracious. I've handed you honesty most people would have to pay for. And you're still standing in my lobby, on my marble, making this club look like a place where this is allowed. So let me put down the soft voice. Since it's wasted on you, you are going to turn around. And you are going to walk out, on your own 2 feet, with whatever dignity you walked in with. Or I am going to call security and have you removed through the front doors in front of every member who's arriving for this afternoon's event. And that, sir, a man your age, hauled out of a country club by security guards, that is a thing people remember. That's a thing that follows an old man around for whatever years he's got left. So you choose. But you choose in the next 30 seconds. Because I am finished spending my afternoon on you. At unu, trei, zec, și trei. The old man looked up at him at last. And he did not turn around. And he said, quietly, "You haven't even asked me my name." "I don't need your name," Tripp said, pleasantly, tugging a cuff. "Names are for members." Real talk, that's the line that gets me. Every single time I tell this story, names are for members. A man born in a cottage at the edge of that very land, whose father tended its grounds and whose mother cleaned its floors, told in the lobby of the club he now owned that he didn't warrant a name. Hold on to that one. It comes back around. And when it does, it lands like an axe. And then Cornelius Ellison did the thing that confused Tripp Caldwell more than anything else could have. He did not argue. And he did not plead. And he did not turn for the door. He closed his hand fully around his father's seed envelope. And he looked up at the failing, frightened, polished young man for a long, level beat, and he nodded, slowly, almost with something like pity for him. "All right," he said. "Now I've seen what kind of door my father's club hides behind these days." He looked, once, out through the tall windows toward the 18th green, toward the vast, spreading crown of the great oak rising against the afternoon sky. The tree his father had planted in secret a lifetime ago. "I'll make one telephone call," he said, "and then I'll be out of your way." Something in the perfect calm of it scratched at Tripp. Some animal part of him that knew, without knowing how it knew, that a man this unbothered, after that much cruelty, was a man holding a card the dealer had not seen. But he was 29, and drowning in his own failure, and had just performed his guardianship flawlessly in front of the Whitfield foursome. And so he tugged his cuffs and let the warning pass. Corey turned, slowly, and walked toward the front doors. Tripp murmured to his assistant, with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. "That," he said, "is how you protect a membership." And he turned back to his beautiful lobby, and his beautiful members, and his beautiful afternoon. For about half an hour, Tripp Caldwell believed he had handled it perfectly. What Tripp did not know was what Corey did just outside the front doors, on the wide stone steps that looked out over the circular drive and the course beyond. He did not slink around to the service entrance the way the cruel always assume the people they crush will simply go. He stood on the steps of the clubhouse his father had cleaned, with the seed envelope in one cracked hand and his phone in the other, and he made 2 calls. The first was to his assistant at the land trust. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a humiliated old man. It was the flat, unhurried, exact voice of a man who had bought and sold more land than most people would see in a lifetime, the voice of someone entirely in command. "It's Corey," he said. "I'm at Hawthorne Grove, standing on the front steps. I need you to do something quietly. Right now, before anyone inside knows to think about it. The clubhouse lobby pulled the security camera coverage for the last half hour. And the audio, if the system carries it. Preserve it. Save it off-site. Don't call the club. Don't warn anyone on the floor. Tell no one out here a thing. Just lock it down where no one inside can touch it." A pause, while the assistant, hearing something in his tone she'd rarely heard, said yes. "Sir. At once." "Good," Corey said. "Thank you." The second call was to the head of the management company that ran the day-to-day of the club, a man named Garrett, who oversaw every operation on the property, and who answered in the structure Corey had set up when he bought the place, directly and only to Corey himself. "Garrett," he said, "it's Cornelius Ellison." He heard, down the line, the small, sharp sound of a man standing up out of his chair. Because in 8 months, Garrett had never once heard that particular quiet in the owner's voice. "No," he said, before Garrett could ask. "Nothing's wrong with the operation. The grounds are beautiful. The books are clean. It's the clubhouse. The front of house. Something is happening in that lobby this afternoon that I need you to come and see with your own eyes. In person. Before I decide what I think about it. Bring the personnel file on the clubhouse manager on duty, Mr. Trip Caldwell. Come now. Come quietly. I'll be on the front steps." And then, the call's made, the machinery in motion. Cornelius Ellison stood alone on the stone steps for a moment, with his father's seed envelope in his hand and the great oak rising green against the sky at the far end of the course. And he let himself feel it. Real talk. This is the part the cameras never catch. And it's the part that matters most. Corey was not, in that moment, thinking about Trip Caldwell at all. He had been sent to the back door before more times than any man should have to count. A boy does not grow up at the margins of a place like Hawthorne Grove. The groundskeeper's son, raking the bunkers with his eyes down, without learning the precise, familiar weight of being made invisible. No, standing on those steps. What Cornelius Ellison was thinking about was a tenant cottage at the edge of this very land, and a father in coveralls just like his own who had cleaned and clipped and tended this club for 50 years and had never once been allowed to walk through the front doors he himself had just been thrown out of. He was thinking about a hidden garden behind the maintenance sheds, and a single oak sapling planted in secret out of a paper seed envelope, and a father's voice saying, "Times the land doesn't care what's written on a card. Son, don't you ever let them make you believe you don't belong on ground your own hands have touched." He was thinking that he had spent 50 years and a fortune climbing toward the day he could buy the very ground his father was never allowed to stand on as a man, and that he had come here today, at last, to put his hands on his father's tree and try to save its life, and that a failing young man in a white polo had looked at him on that ground, on that errand, and called him a piece of garbage and a grubby little packet of seeds, and told him he didn't warrant a name, and sent him to the dumpsters his father had walked past every day for 50 years. Of all the things Trip had said, that was the one that found the old wound and pressed down on it with its full weight. The service entrance. Around the back. The door. For people like you. Because Corey had bought this entire club, every blade of it, so that no son of any groundskeeper would ever again be told that the front door wasn't his. He wiped his eyes once. Hard. With the back of a cracked, earth-blackened hand. He closed the envelope in his palm, and then he stood up straight, inside the same soil-stained coveralls. Because he had decided something, and the thing he had decided was this. He would go back in wearing exactly what he was wearing now. Not the good suit from behind the seat of the truck. Not a clean shirt. The coveralls. The mud. The split knuckles. Because he wanted Trip Caldwell to understand, with total and unsurvivable clarity, that nothing whatsoever about the man in that lobby had changed in the last half hour. Not one thread. The only thing that was about to change, the only thing that had ever been the difference, was what Trip knew. And here, for a moment, it looked as though none of it would land. Because as Corey stood on the steps waiting for Garrett, his assistant called back. And the news was bad. The lobby's main camera? The one trained on the spot where Tripp had stood over him. It had been down for a month. A lightning strike in the spring had taken out a run of the system. And the repair had been put off and put off the way maintenance is at a club, bleeding money. And that whole quadrant of the lobby had no working coverage at all. There was footage from the front desk angle, but it was distant and silent. You could see an old man and a manager and a young woman stepping forward and being waved off, but you could not hear one single word of what was said. "I'm sorry." "Sir," the assistant said. From the desk angle, you can see it happened. But you can't prove what he said. There's no audio. It's his word on what went on in that lobby. Corey stood with the phone to his ear and said nothing for a moment. And real talk, this is the moment the whole thing nearly tipped the other way. The way it so often does in life. Where the polished young man tugs his cuffs and walks away clean, because the proof simply isn't there. Because it's his word. Confident and well-bred, and in a club polo, against a filthy old groundskeeper who, as far as anyone could prove, just wandered in the wrong door and made a fuss when he was asked to leave. Tripp could deny every word of it. He could say the old man had been belligerent, confused, that he'd asked him politely to use the proper entrance, and the man had refused. Without the audio, that is a story, a charming, frightened, well-connected young man can absolutely sell to the people who'd want to believe it. But Cornelius Ellison had bought and built and fought over land for 50 years. And a man who does that for 50 years knows, in his bonds, that there is never only one witness to anything, and that the truth has a structure all its own. The desk camera, he said. Does it show the young woman? The girl from the pro shop? Does it show her step forward? And then turn and walk off toward the lower lot? A pause. While the assistant checked. Yes. Sir. Clear as day. You can see her come up. You can see him wave her away. You can see her go. Good, said Corey. Then we don't need his words on a tape. We've got hers. Because Tasha had heard every word, and Tasha had stepped forward, and the member in whites had heard it, and the assistant at the desk had heard it, and the Whitfield foursome had passed straight through the middle of it, and an old man who could tell Garrett in advance, before a single one of them was asked, exactly what the clubhouse manager had said. Down to the dumpsters and the grubby seeds, and times names are for members. And then have witness after witness, questioned, apart from one another. Repeat it back word for word. That is an old man telling the truth. And every honest person in the chain of it would know the difference. The proof was never going to be only the camera. The proof was the room. It always is. At Doi, 0. With the clubhouse filling for the member event and the lobby bright with arriving golf whites and the low buzz of 4 generations of belonging, Cornelius Ellison walked back through the front doors of the Hawthorne Grove clubhouse. Tripp saw the soil-stained coveralls first and felt a hot, clean spark of irritation jump up his spine and started across the marble toward him, already tugging his cuffs straight. The words half-loaded and ready on his tongue times. Sir, I thought I made myself perfectly clear times, and then he saw who had come through the front doors a single step behind the old man, holding one of the great doors open for him, and his hand froze on his cuff, and the words died in his throat before they ever reached his teeth. It was Garrett, the head of the management company, the man whose name was at the top of every directive that came down to the clubhouse. The man every manager on the property feared. The man Tripp had been desperately trying for months to impress. Because Garrett was the one person who could either save his charity job or end it. And Garrett was holding the heavy front door open, times holding the door, times for the old man in the muddy coveralls. And as he did it, he was saying, in a tone of deference Tripp had genuinely never once heard him use in all his time at the club. "After you, Mr. Ellison. Please, take all the time you need." Mr. Ellison. Tripp's mind, racing now, threw up 3 desperate explanations in the space of a single breath. A wealthy eccentric who liked to garden, some oddball millionaire, and he had just some old retired employee being indulged by the company for old time's sake. Harmless. Irrelevant. Please let it be that. Somebody's father. Somebody's grandfather. Anyone. Anyone at all. But... And then Garrett stopped in the center of the marble lobby. In the bright afternoon light. In front of the member in whites who had looked away. In front of the assistant at the desk. In front of a lobby that was... group. By arriving group. Beginning to fall silent and turn to watch. And he said the words that took the entire clubhouse and turned it over. "Tripp," he said, "I would like to introduce you, properly, to Mr. Cornelius Ellison. Aphouse." You could have heard a single leaf settle on the marble. "He owns Hawthorne Grove," Garrett said, his voice carrying now, clear and unhurried, into every corner of the silencing lobby. All of it. The course. This clubhouse. The land it stands on. The marble floor. You were so worried about his boots. The front doors you threatened to have security drag him through. He bought this club 8 months ago, when the old families had run it into the ground and the land went up for sale. And he didn't buy it as a stranger. Tripp. He was born here, in a tenant cottage at the edge of the 5th fairway. His father was the head groundskeeper of this club for 50 years, and his mother cleaned these very floors. And as a boy, Mr. Ellison caddied on this course and raked these bunkers and was made to use the service entrance. The same back door you just ordered him to? The great oak by the 18th, the one in our brochure. The one members take their wedding photos under. His father planted that tree, with his own hands. From an acorn. He has forgotten more about this ground than every member in this building will ever know. His voice dropped then, and went flat, and went cold. And somehow the cold of it filled the lobby more completely than any shout could have. "And I am given to understand," he said, "that over the last half hour you called this man garbage. That you told him he was pathetic to look at. That you took the seed envelope his late father gave him out of his hand and called it a grubby little packet. And that you told him in a clubhouse that belongs to him. That his father built with his own back. That he did not warrant a name." The lobby had gone utterly, completely silent. Arriving members stood frozen in the doorway with their bags, out by the entrance to the lower lot. Tasha had come back in and stopped dead, one hand rising slowly to cover her mouth, her eyes enormous. You could watch it land on Tripp Caldwell's face in stages. The way the lights go out down the length of the clubhouse at the end of a long night. One window at a time. The dark traveling along the building. First, poor confusion. A man hearing words in an order that refused to make sense. Then a thin, frantic, drowning flash of hope that this was a setup. Some cruel hazing the senior staff ran. Please let it be a joke. And then as he looked, truly looked, perhaps for the very first time, at the man he had called a piece of garbage, at the cracked and earth-blackened hands, the soil-stained coveralls, the split knuckles, the soft, worn envelope cupped in one palm. The dark reached the far end of the building, and the last light went out. And Tripp Caldwell understood, all at once and far too late, that every single thing he had read as proof that this man did not belong, was in fact the unmistakable, unfakeable signature of someone who had given his whole life to the one true thing that Tripp only ever postured at guarding. The hands he had sneered at were the same hands, generation for generation, that had built and tended every beautiful inch of the ground he stood on. The grubby little seed packet was the origin of the very tree the members worshipped, and the man he'd sent to the dumpsters owned the land beneath all of it. Every blade, every brick, every grain of the marble under his own polished shoes. His hand fell away from his cuff and hung at his side, and it was trembling. "Mr. Ellison," he said, and his voice had gone to paper. "Sir, I had no idea who you were. If I'd had any idea who you were, I never would have." And there it is. The self-incriminating line. The confession the cruel always make in the wreckage. Mistaking it for an apology. Never once hearing what it actually says about them. And here is the line Corey had carried in from the steps. In his father's grip. The one he had been turning over in his cracked hand for half an hour. He did not raise his voice. He had no need to. The whole lobby was his now. And silent. And waiting. He opened his hand and tipped 2 dark acorns from his father's faded seed envelope out into his palm and held them up. Just slightly. Into the bright window light. And he looked at the trembling young man. And he said, "No, you didn't know who I was. And that, son, that right there is the whole of what's wrong with you." He let it settle into the hush. And then he went on. Quietly. Terribly. Kindly. "You just told me that if you'd known who I was, you'd never have treated me this way. You'd have held the door and called these hands a marvel and walked me out to that tree yourself. And you think that's your defense? You think it makes it better. Sown. That times is times the crime. You didn't know, and so you looked at my coveralls, and my boots, and my cracked black hands, and you decided in about 4 seconds that I was nothing, that I was filth, that I was furniture, that I didn't warrant a name. And you do that every single day, at that door, to every working soul who comes near it, looking like they earn their bread with their body instead of their birth. The men you send around to the back, the grounds crew, the kitchen staff, the people who keep every blade of this place alive. Do you understand? They belong to this ground more than 4 generations of members ever will, because they're the ones whose hands are actually in the dirt. My father tended this land for 50 years and was never once allowed through the door. You just threw me out of. He planted that oak you all photograph. In secret. Behind the sheds. Because a man told him he didn't belong on the very grass he kept alive. I came here today to try to save his tree. And you sent me to the dumpsters to do it? He closed his fist gently around the 2 acorns. My father gave me these. Off that tree. And he told me the land doesn't care what's written on a card, that it knows the difference between a man who tends it and a man who only struts across it. And that I should never, ever let anyone make me believe I didn't belong on ground my own hands had touched. You, Son, have spent your whole life strutting across ground other people tend. Terrified. Somebody'll notice you never put a single root down in it. That's why you guard that door so hard, and that is exactly why. Standing right here. On land my family has bled into for 3 generations. With the proof of my whole life sitting in your fingers when you took that envelope, you couldn't tell. To save your life. The difference between the man who owns this ground and a piece of garbage off the road. The clothes lie. Song. They always lie. The land never does. And you've spent your whole life listening only to the close. The reckoning, when it came down clean and quiet and complete. The way good ground takes a seed. No shouting. No scene for the members to feed on. Every element exactly where it belonged. Garrett did not have to go digging far for proof of anything. The lobby's main camera had been dead for a month that lightning strike in the spring. The deferred repair. The small, ordinary rot that creeps into even a 4-generation club bleeding money. And Tripp must have felt, in the first seconds, a flicker of the old confidence. No audio. No words on record. His polish in its white polo against an old man's story. But there was the desk camera. Distant and silent and clear. Showing him standing over the old man. Showing Tasha step forward and showing him wave her away. There was Tasha herself, who had heard every word. There was the assistant at the desk, and the member in whites, and the Whitfield foursome, and the better part of a lobby that had caught the edges of it. And above all, there was the simple, damning fact that Mr. Ellison had told Garrett before a single witness was questioned. Exactly what the clubhouse manager had said, the dumpsters, the grubby seeds. Names are for members, times, and then witness after witness. Asked separately. Had repeated it back word for word. A man who can recite a speech in advance is a man who heard that speech. The proof was never going to be only a camera. The proof was the room. And the room did not lie for Tripp Caldwell. There would be no version of events. There would be no he said. There was the truth. And there were a dozen people who had stood inside it. Tripp Caldwell was not fired in a shout. Corey did not believe in shouts. And a clubhouse runs on a hush that screaming would have shattered for every member in it. He was relieved of his post quietly. Before the member event ever began. Walked off the floor. He had guarded so fiercely by the very man whose approval he had craved for months and would now never have. His whole philosophy of protecting the membership stood revealed. In the cold light of that afternoon, for the small and frightened thing it had always been, a failing man, drowning in the shame of being the lesser son of a great family, trying to feel like he belonged at the top by deciding, day after day, who belonged at the bottom. And here is the detail that turns the knife. The detail that came out after. This was not the first place Tripp had done it. He had been quietly let go from a yacht club 2 years before. For precisely this same thing. Dressed up in precisely the same words. Times protecting the membership. He had told everyone, including himself, that he'd times moved on. And only now, standing in the wreckage with 2 acorns held up in the window light in front of his eyes, did Tripp Caldwell begin? Dimly. To understand that the thing he kept calling guardianship, the thing he was so proud of, the thing he believed finally made him worth something, was the exact same thing that kept getting him thrown out of every beautiful place he ever clung to. The hands he sneered at were a mirror, and he had refused. Again and again, year after year, to look into it right up until the afternoon, the mirror turned out to own the land. But Cornelius Ellison did not build his life on punishment. And this story does not end on Tripp Caldwell. Because the lesson a father pressed into a boy's hand behind the maintenance sheds, a lifetime ago, was never, not for 1 second, about the cruel. It was always only about who tends the ground and who gets to belong on it. Corey turned in the silent and watching lobby, and he found Tasha, 22 years old, 6 weeks on the job, the one who had set down her scorecards and stepped forward and said times, "Let me help him. Let me just find out what he's here about. I'll walk him out myself." the one who had been banished to scrub the carts on the lower lot, with her eyes shining and furious, for the crime of wanting to help an old man instead of assuming he was trash. "You tried to help me," Corey said to her, gently, across the quiet room, "when helping me looked to everyone in here like a waste of your afternoon. He told you that you were watching a lesson today. He was right about that much. At least he simply had every single part of it upside down. You times were the lesson. Child, not me." Within the week, and this is exactly how it went, Tasha was no longer scrubbing carts on the lower lot. Mr. Ellison had personally placed her into a program he founded and funded the moment he bought the club, a hospitality and management scholarship. With a sponsored degree and a mentor and a real path upward, created specifically for the children of working families, the grounds crews, the kitchen staff, the cleaners, the caddies, the very people his father had been. The people Hawthorne Grove had spent 4 generations rendering invisible. The talk on the grounds, 3 years on now, is that the girl is rising fast, that the old man saw the whole of it, not in anything Tasha had achieved, because she'd achieved nothing yet, but in the simple sound of her voice saying, "Times, let me just find out what he's here about." Real talk, that is the part of this whole story that closes my throat every single time I tell it. The one who did the small, brave, unprofitable kindness, in the exact moment it might have cost her, the only job she had, times was handed the whole future. The open front door. The very belonging the cruel man had sworn. At that desk. The old groundskeeper had no claim to, and the assistant at the front desk, the silent witness, the one who had given the uncomfortable little laugh when Tripp made his joke about the help forgetting their place, who had glanced at the old man and then looked away. He came and found Corey before the event began, twisting his hands in front of him, unable to meet his eyes. He said he was ashamed. He said he had stood right there and watched it happen and said nothing. Not one word. And that his own father had cut grass for a living his whole life. And that he had looked away from a man who could have been his own dad. Corey did not lecture him. He had no use for lectures. He put one cracked, earth-blackened hand on the young man's shoulder and said only, "Then be the one who holds the door. Next time. That's how a man squares an account like this one. Not with me. With the next fella who comes to that door looking like he belongs at the back of it. Be the one who speaks." And the young man nodded. Slowly. Like something heavy had finally been set down in good soil where it belonged. Because, of course, the story got out. The way these stories always, eventually, get out. The silent desk footage of the old man in the muddy coveralls, and the account that came with it pieced together from Tasha, from the remorseful desk assistant, from a lobby full of people who had heard it of an immaculate clubhouse manager calling a 72-year-old groundskeeper's son garbage, mocking the seed envelope his dead father gave him, telling him he didn't warrant a name. And then the slow, devastating reveal that the old man in the coveralls had been born in a cottage at the edge of that course, that his father had planted the club's beloved oak in secret, and that he had risen across a lifetime to buy the entire club his family was never allowed to belong to, ran past 10 million views inside a single week. It ran under a hashtag a stranger coined from the line. Garrett was quoted giving a reporter at the club gates the next morning, "Number the land knows." People began posting photographs of their own parents and grandparents cracked, soil blackened, hard-working hands. Beside the humble and beloved things those hands had grown and built and tended across a lifetime, the gardens, the trees, the seed packets passed down, a small, good, warm thing, the way the world. Every so often, when you have nearly given up on it. Let's one take root. And a few months later, at Mr. Seng, Ellison's direct and immovable insistence, over the strenuous objections of more than one old member who threatened to resign, Hawthorne Grove tore the locks off its own front doors. The 11-year waiting list, the one engineered to keep the place pure, was thrown out. New memberships were opened, at real prices. And a foundation Corey created began bringing the children of the grounds, crews, and the caddies and the kitchen staff onto that course to learn the game. Their families had only ever been allowed to maintain for other people. The service entrance by the dumpsters, the door Corey's father had used for 50 years. The door Corey had been ordered to use was closed for good, bricked over, and the entire staff, every cook and cleaner and groundskeeper, was given a key to the front and, mounted on the wall of the lobby, on the marble, at eye level, where every staffer and every manager and every member would have to pass it and read it each time they walked through those front doors, was a small bronze plaque. It carried no club crest. It carried no slogan. It carried a single line, with the simple shape of an oak leaf and an acorn cast into the metal beneath the words, "The land knows who tends it." As for the great oak by the 18th, Corey's father's tree, the rot at its roots was caught in time. Treated by an arborist, the owner hired, and stood beside personally, his own cracked hands in the soil at its base. The tree lived, and the 2 acorns from the faded envelope, the ones Corey had held up in the window light, he planted himself that autumn. On his knees, in the dirt, in his soil-stained coveralls, in the open, in full view of the clubhouse, one on either side of his father's oak, because some things you do not lock away behind glass, and do not hand to a brochure, and do not, ever, let anyone tell you don't belong in the ground. The whole point of them, the only point, the thing Moses had trusted a 19-year-old boy above anyone in the world to one day truly understand, was knowing exactly what a thing is worth, while you hold it in your own cracked and honest working hand. No matter at all. What some failing young man in a crisp white polo decides that it costs. This story is fiction. Corey isn't real. Moses isn't real. Trip Caldwell isn't real. And neither is Hawthorne Grove, nor the 11-year list, nor the great oak by the 18th. But the young man tugging his cuffs is real. He is standing at some door. Somewhere, right now, a clubhouse door. A lobby door. The gate of some green and gated place you and I will never be waved into. And he is deciding in about 4 seconds, by the stain on a pair of coveralls, and the dirt under a stranger's nails, and the cracks worked into their hands, whose presence belongs, and whose is pathetic to look at, and who, exactly, should be sent around to the back where they can't be seen. That happens every single day. At the doors of places like that one, all over this country, to people who own no membership and never will, and who far more often than the cruel could ever bring themselves to guess, belong to the ground they're standing on, more truly than the person sending them away ever could. Because their hands are the ones that have actually been in the dirt. So, let me ask you, before you go, the next time you see it happen, and you will see it happen, the next time you watch someone get sent around to the service entrance for the simple crime of looking like they've worked the land instead of inherited it, the old man in the muddy coveralls, the tired woman with the cracked hands, the stranger with the dirt under their nails, which one are you going to be? Are you the one at the desk who gives the uncomfortable little laugh and then looks back down at the work? Or are you the one who steps forward and says, "Let me help him. Let me just find out what he's here for"? It's no trouble at all? Tell me, down in the comments, would you have said something that afternoon? Or would you have folded and gone to scrub the carts? Be honest. And if this story reached you, if it put a lump in your throat or a name to something you've felt, send it to someone who needs the reminder. And subscribe. Because there is a pair of cracked, soil-blackened working hands and a tugged straight cuff in every single story we tell here. Don't be a Trip. Be a Tasha. And whatever you do, however the person standing at your door happens to be dressed, remember that the land knows who tends it. And so should you.